In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the telephoto lens that is best for your style of wildlife photography. Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. I want to talk to you about telephoto lenses, and specifically the telephoto lens that you will use to help you achieve your artistic goals in wildlife photography. The telephoto lens is a lens that you will use probably more than any other to photograph wildlife. It's also, in all likelihood, the most expensive lens that you will have in your kit, and possibly even the most expensive piece of gear in your kit, more expensive than many camera bodies. So it's really important to make the best decision when we select this lens. Now, this is a subject that has been discussed many other times and in many other ways, but the thing that I really want to talk about is the idea of choosing this lens to help you achieve your artistic goals. It's very easy to get gear and then let that gear drive what you do artistically, but I think it's more interesting to know what you're trying to achieve artistically and then get the gear that helps you achieve those goals. And also, just as important is to know when you have gear that is not helping you achieve those goals. When we have this discussion, I'm going to talk about some of the lenses that Sony has, some of their telephoto lenses that are suitable for wildlife photography, but this is not about Sony equipment, and this discussion is applicable to any system, and no matter what system you're on, there are, in all likelihood, other lenses that are similar to the ones that I'll talk about. The other thing is that I'm not going to talk about specifications or technical details, image quality tests and comparisons and so forth. Of course, those things are very important and you should absolutely consider them when you make a buying decision. But in addition to those things, I think it's really important to talk about some of the other things that we'll talk about in this video. So let's get started. Let's talk about zooms versus primes. This is something that you'll encounter immediately once you start looking at telephoto lenses. If we look at what Sony has available in their range, for example, there is a 100 to 400 and a 200 to 600 and a 400 and a 600. So in other words, there are two zooms and two primes. There are many obvious differences between zooms and primes. The thing to consider, I think, is this. When you are shooting with a zoom lens, you have more choice available. You have more flexibility because you can zoom in and out. With a prime lens, you're stuck at a particular focal length. So you have more choice. This means that you have to make decisions. And there are times when you will try to make that decision, especially in the heat of the moment when you're trying to take photos, and you make a decision that is not necessarily the best decision. Sometimes that decision will be that you will be out too wide, and you really, when you go to edit the photo later on, you will wish that you had zoomed in closer, because when you try to crop it in later on, perhaps you don't have enough resolution to play with. But the case that's much worse is that you actually get in too tight. So you zoom all the way in, and then of course when you go to edit, you can't zoom back out because you've already lost that part of the image that you cropped out when you zoomed in. And so this is the thing. I think that when you are shooting with a zoom, there's a possibility that you make a decision like this and you shoot too tight, and that is in fact a tendency that most people have, that they tend to get in too tight and they take shots that look like they might as well have been taken at a zoo. So having the ability to make that decision and the flexibility at the time of shooting is not necessarily a good thing. And also related to that is that when you are making that decision and then you're changing the zoom, when you're zooming in and out, you're taking up time to do that. So that is time where you could potentially lose a critical moment and not capture a frame. And the more frenetic things become when you're shooting, if there are, for example, multiple subjects, let's say you're surrounded by subjects, like let's say you're in a river with 10 bears around you. That was exactly what happened to me. early this year. And you have all kinds of possibilities now for what you're going to shoot, and some of those subjects are going to be closer, and some of them are going to be further away, and so you're going crazy potentially, zooming in and out, trying to frame things, and you may make some great decisions, you may not, and as I said, you may also lose some moments because fail to capture those moments because you're mucking around, zooming in and out. Now, the other thing to consider is that with prime lenses, that you are stuck at a particular focal length, but one way that can be good is it can actually help you get out of your comfort zone and shoot in a way that you might not normally shoot, because you will be forced, you'll have no other choice. Sometimes you will take a shot that is way tighter than what you might want to take, or it's going to be way wider than you might want to take. Whereas if you had been using a zoom lens, you might tend to just do things the same way all the time, right? You might see a particular subject in a particular situation, and you'll always frame it the same way every time. You'll always zoom in to the roughly the same focal length every time. So that's another thing to consider as well. Now, related to zooms and primes is the discussion of aperture, because most of the prime lenses tend to be big apertures like f4 or f2.8, and most of the zoom lenses have smaller apertures. Now, of course, this is a consideration when you are calculating exposure and in terms of the light that you have available, but the greater consideration from an artistic standpoint is subject isolation. If you have a big aperture, you're able to isolate the subject out from the foreground and the background, and this allows you to do some interesting things. Now we have to remember that it doesn't mean that if you're using a zoom lens that you can't isolate the subject in a similar way. If you're close enough to the subject and the subject is far enough away from other elements, say in the background, you can also get some fantastic subject isolation. So you have to consider what subjects you're typically shooting, and also what are you trying to achieve with the images. Are you often trying to isolate the subject? One of the things that happens, for example, if you're shooting birds in flight, is typically those birds will be up in the sky. There will be nothing in front of the bird, between you and the bird, and behind the bird there will typically only be the sky. So it's relatively easier to get that subject isolation. Although what you will typically get in terms of the sky being out of focus is usually not going to be that interesting, especially if it's just a clear blue sky. Ideally, there's actually something interesting going on there, and you've got clouds or something else. So think about what types of subjects you're shooting, and also what you're trying to achieve, and whether or not the subject isolation that you can get out of a bigger aperture is something that's really important to you, or whether or not there are other things that are more important to you. Let's talk about focal length. In Sony's lineup, they have 4 possibilities as an example. So they have a 100 to 400 zoom, a 200 to 600 zoom, a 400 prime, and a 600 prime. So in other words, they have 2 basic possibilities when it comes to the focal length, and that's 400 or 600 millimeters. And my main point here around focal length, as it is with pretty much any other aspect of this discussion, is that it is important to figure out what you're trying to do and pick the right tool for that, and don't buy into any preconceived notions of what a lens is good for, or what lens is the best for a certain thing. So for example, when someone says 600 is the only serious wildlife lens, 400 is a sport lens, that doesn't make any sense to me. Some people are photographing little subjects like little birds that are far away, and yet they want to fill up the frame with the subject. Other people are photographing much bigger animals, and they're able to get close to them, and yet they want to have more of an environmental shot with space around the subject. So there are a huge range of possibilities. Related to this is when people say things like, a certain focal length is good for one thing or best for that thing. So as an example, I made a video recently about the 135 millimeter focal length, and it wasn't in response to that video, but elsewhere someone said 135 is best for portraits. what does that mean? Portraits of people? Well, I take portraits of wildlife, I take portraits of nature, landscapes, and I use 135 in some cases for both of those things.
Now I want to show you a series of images that demonstrate part of my artistic style in wildlife photography. These are all photos where I try to create a sense of intimacy between the viewer and the subject. You may notice that the framing is quite tight, so you might think that I'm using a longer lens such as a 600mm lens, but I'm not. I'm using a 400mm lens. What gives these portraits their sense of intimacy has much more to do with the perspective than the framing, but focal length does play a very important role in this. This is something that I've mentioned in a number of other videos. When you are shooting from above an animal, the perspective is not so great. It makes the animal look smaller and you look like you're detached from the animal's world. When you are able to get down at eye level, you get a much better perspective that brings the viewer into the world of the animal. And when you're able to get even lower and shoot from below, you get an even stronger perspective, and one that is quite unique and that you don't see very often. If you have to shoot from above a subject, it's actually better to be further away so that you can appear to be more at eye level with the animal. But here's the thing, as the animal comes closer, you'll have to shoot down more, and this will make it look even more so like you're shooting from above, which is not good. So if you shoot from above an animal quite often, such as from a vehicle or a platform, you'll actually get a better perspective when you have greater distances between you and your subject. And in these cases, a lens with a longer focal length can be more useful. Now, if you're able to shoot from below an animal, this is a great place to be because you'll never appear to be above it regardless of the distance. And if the animal does move closer, you'll have to shoot up even more, but this will give you an even stronger perspective. So if you're shooting from below, such as on the ground or in the water, you can get a better perspective when subjects are closer, and in these cases, a shorter focal length is actually more useful.
So that's the end of the discussion. Now you might be thinking, hold on, is that really all there is? No, it's not really all there is, because this is actually a very complex topic. Selecting a telephoto lens, there are a lot of things to consider, including the technical details that I mentioned we wouldn't cover. But here's the thing, a lot of these other considerations, which are definitely things that you should know about, such as, let's say, image quality of prime lenses versus zoom lenses. Yes, all things being equal, the prime lens will typically have better image quality than a zoom lens. Now the question is, how much better do you need that better quality, especially given the price and the weight and so forth? All of that is stuff that you can find out from other sources. What I really want to do in this video is plant the seed with you that it's really important to have an idea of where you're trying to be artistically. Where are you today? Where are you trying to go? And to then select the tools that help you get there, and then also know when those tools are not helping you get there. Now, I realize also that there are situations when, let's say for budget reasons, you can't get the thing that you think is actually the best tool for you, right? And that doesn't mean that you can't still achieve those goals. It just means that you may have to work harder in order to achieve them, right? Or you may have, a particular shot in mind that you think you can only get using a certain kind of lens, and maybe that shot just has to wait, or you just have to find a different way of getting that shot. As I mentioned before, as an example, right? Like, yes, a lot of the zoom lenses typically don't have, especially the ones that are variable aperture, they don't have big apertures. And so if you're trying to isolate the subject, it is harder, but it's not impossible. So anyway, I hope this has been a thought-provoking video for you more than anything else. It's not really, as I said, it's not really so much about selecting the right lens, right? It's more about how do we use gear, right? Because we talk so much about it, and yes, it's important, but it's just tools that help us get to where we want to go. And ideally, we have an idea of what that is, and we use the tools to support that, and we don't just buy gear for the sake of buying gear. And that's really what this video has been about. So I hope you found it interesting. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.